Welcome to Frequency. I'm Jenni Field.
And I'm Gose.
Frequency is your go-to for real talk about comms, culture, and employee experience, beyond the buzzwords and straight to what matters. Now, I'm going to kick things off today with a few things to talk about. The first is that I'm not very well. So this is our first podcast recording with me with tonsillitis, which is lovely. So I feel like I sound a bit weird, but Chuck, you don't think I sound that weird. So
I don't think so.
That's good. I've got some honey and hot water here, so I'll be having that while we go. But I'm on the mend, which is good. The second thing I wanted to talk about was I was at a funeral this week, sounding all very sad at the moment, isn't it? But at the end of the funeral, there was a really strong message about the need to enjoy life. And I think sometimes we can talk so much about the negative stuff out there and how challenging things are and how hard things are. And sure, they are. But I really believe in enjoying life and having fun. And I just wanted to take that message and share that with people a bit more, to just really embrace and enjoy life while you can. But the really important thing I want to talk about is the Indy 500, because you were there at the weekend.
Mm-hmm.
And I know it's a big deal. And I had a little look at it, and I was following your wife, Kristen, and her first experience of it as well, whilst I was watching the Formula One at home in the UK. And it felt quite similar, but very different to that at the same time. So I was just interested in how it was. How was her first experience? And for anyone that doesn't know what it is it?
Yeah. So I want to go back to your first point. You mentioned you said some hot water and lemon
Yes.
there with
No,
you.
hot water and honey.
Hot water and honey, sorry.
Yes.
Next time, add some lemon and some whiskey or bourbon to it. Then you've got a hot toddy, which is the ultimate cure-all. And then to your second point around enjoying life, just to remind you, your name is Fun Spice.
This is, well, I
Jenny.
thought this was while you were saying it. I was like,
yes,
Fun Spice is here.
That's sticking through. And yes, we're at the Indy 500, which is a pretty amazing event, even if you are not a racing fan. We are fortunate in that we live less than a 20-minute drive, not on race day, to the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. And it's really the grand scale of it. When you think about that, the event hosts 350,000 people on race day, which comes out to about 1 out of every 1,000 Americans is in this 2.5 mile oval, which is it's just remarkable. And it is a bit of a cultural experience as well outside of the track. And there's the snake pit on the inside of the track. And I think for people to just get a scale for how big this speedway is, there's this map out there, you can Google it, or maybe if I find it, we'll link it in the show notes, of all of the things that fit inside the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. And it's things like the White House, the Vatican, the Rose Bowl, like all of these things combined all fit on the infield of Indianapolis Motor Speedway. So yeah, we had a great time. It was a great experience. It was actually a little chilly, which was actually better for a first Indy 500 experience instead of it being 90 degrees and humid. But it is a very polar experience, I would say, to F1 in Monaco. When you see the yachts, see the yachts at Monaco, that would be like the high-end RVs at Indy 500. And then also later on the same day as a NASCAR race as well. So you've got like the F1, IndyCar, and NASCAR. And I just heard that they're moving the Monaco race next year to not be on the same day, which apparently a lot of racing fans are kind of annoyed by, because it got to be this sort of day of racing for people that really enjoy auto racing. All these 3 races were all on the same day. But yeah, we had a great time. It was a great first experience for her. There's some things we did well. We had a great food and beverage plan, pat on the back for that. Obviously some things we're going to improve if we go back. But yeah, all in all, really great Indy 500 experience, especially for her first time.
Good. So what have you got for us to chat about this week?
Absolutely. So before we jump into our first story, which comes with a pretty stark headline, and we've talked about the power of headlines around firing squads. We're going to set the scene of what's happening across all the workplace landscapes out there. One story we're going to talk about that stood out came from Fortune, where a major pharmaceutical company just cut nearly half of its middle managers. They said it wasn't about saving money. We'll see. Then there's an annual trends report from Workshop, which painted a picture of the internal comms world trying to do more while still staying human. Some of it feels possible. Some of it we'll see. And finally, Weber Shandwick, later research shows that at a time of political division and distrust, people are actually looking to businesses to bring people together. Yes, their business is a source of stability and truth, which I think is an interesting for us to talk about. But Jenni, let's first start with the headline that's from friendly faces to firing squads about what's really happening inside today's corporate culture. The article outlines a stark transformation of workplace culture from one focused on positivity and inclusion to one now driven by fear, surveillance, and a relentless push for performance. It traces how, in the state of workplace layoffs and economic pressure, the veneer of this culture first values might be slipping a bit or just simply being outright discarded. One key theme is the performative nature, I love that word, of modern corporate culture, where many companies invested in DEI statements and onboarding swag and internal branding. But then when the hard decisions arrived, those same companies didn't communicate with empathy. They just executed layoffs in these cold, impersonal ways. And the article suggested that culture was used more as a PR strategy than a guiding principle. And another powerful insight is the rise of this performance surveillance, which we talked about on last week's episode. More companies are leaning into productivity tracking, AI-assisted evaluations, and stack ranking, turning up the pressure on employees and managers alike. Feels like this shift is leaving employees disengaged and even more distrusting, particularly when feedback disappears until the moment it becomes punitive. The term firing squad, which caught my attention, might sound harsh, but I think for many employees, it reflects that emotional whiplash that they feel being told they're part of a family right up until that exit email hits their inbox. So my question to you, Jenni, a lot of this reads like a breakdown between this gap between stated culture and actual behavior. So from your perspective, what happens when a company's values only show up in the good times? And how can communicators prepare for or push back on this kind of whiplash event?
I mean, I love the headline. Like, I mean, it stopped you, and I just think it's frighteningly accurate, actually. And I know that there is different laws from both of our sides of the pond, essentially, in terms of how people are removed from organizations. I think there's a lot more involved over this side in terms of that happening and consultancies and things where I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think on your side, people can just kind of be fired and
They can.
yeah, yeah. So
Yep.
there is a little kind of difference there on that. But I do think that there is a gap. When you asked that question about like what happens when the values only show up in the good times, my gut reaction to that was, do they show up in the good times? Like, do they show up at all? Because I do sometimes think they are just words or phrases that people have and they're not being lived. I know a lot of the places that I'm working with, we come back to what are your values? And quite often it's a question of, oh, let me double check, or oh, I think it's this, or they're not always embodied in the culture in the way that we know they should be, believe they should be. And so for me, your values have to guide you in the good, the bad, and the ugly. And if they are only showing up in the good times, then they are not your values, right? That's not how values work, because they should actually be there the most during times of crisis. And actually, I remember years ago hearing a case study from, I think it was a police force in the UK, linked to a quite significant crisis that ended up in quite tragic quite tragic results. And throughout all of that, I remember the chief police officer that was involved, and he came and spoke at an event, and he was basically saying that our values were what guided our crisis response. Like, we came back to them on everything, and that guided us through. So I almost I was going to say, I almost don't mind if they don't show up in the good times because they absolutely have to show up in the bad times. I'm just not convinced that values the have the same meaning and value as we want them to have, and I think that's part of the problem. I think the point about this being performative, that I think you said about it being like a performative nature of corporate culture is this sort of, and I think it has become that. I think it has completely become that. I think it's become part of what this is what we should say. This is what we should be doing. So we're just going to do it. And it is only so long you can get away with that, right? Comes back to some of the work I do on credibility. You can only pretend for so long until somebody realizes that it's not genuine and it's not real. And I think where we are now in terms of workplace and what's happening, the proof is being seen in that performative nature, unfortunately.
I think there's a little bit of salesmanship that comes into that stated culture, and that becomes the performance part. And I remember years ago being at an event where I've seen where some companies actually make their culture sort of part of their product. And one of this company's things they did was you could go on a tour of their company to see the culture. And I remember somebody telling me that they then said, "Well, I want to go, what's in that building over there?" And they're like, "Oh, that's where our accounting and finance team sits." And they were like, "Well, I want to see what it looks like over there." And they're like, "Oh, that's not part of the tour. We don't get to see that." So I do think there's a little bit of salesmanship that comes in, which I guess to some degree I'm okay with. But I do think it's when that gap shows up. When you say one thing and act another thing, that's then when employees start to call BS on it.
Yeah.
But I also think that's then when we see how companies behave, it's like, oh, you actually didn't really believe in what you were telling your people.
Yeah. And there's just like this, quite frankly, there's just no need to behave that way. Like there's just I can't I can't get my head around not being aligned in that. Like if you want to have a culture that is, you know what, we don't really care about our people. They are a commodity, they are an asset. We need to have people to do stuff, but we're not interested in your development, but we need you to come and do stuff because we're going to make you loads of money and we want you to do this, right? Fine. There will be people that will want to do that, that might want to make loads of money and not care about the investment and work there for 6 months. And they might say, we expect you to be here for 6 months, but we're cool with that because the way we've created our onboarding and we're done, we're cool with it. Nobody's ever going to say that because it's like, that's just not okay in modern society. But I also feel like if that's genuinely how you feel, then own that and be that because you will appeal to some people. And yes, people will hate that and talk about it being outrageous and all those things. But at least you're being genuine and you've created an environment and a structure and a process that supports that rather than lying about it and pretending to be something else. And then when people come in, that's not right. That's just not nice and it's not kind. And I don't really understand why anyone would think that's okay.
I was thinking as you were talking there about like this, almost like this body language that companies have where they would say they're not saying it, but their body language is.
Yeah.
Like how they're positioning themselves, they are saying those things. They just wouldn't say
Yes.
that that
Yeah.
they're saying those things. All
Yeah.
right, let's move along to the next article. This called Not Just Slash and Burn. Article focuses on a major pharmaceutical company's decision to eliminate 40% of its middle managers. The company insists the move wasn't about cost cutting, but about quote unquote, I love these phrases, restructuring for speed and clearing decision making bottlenecks. Executives argue that middle managers were slowing down innovation and creating distance between leadership and employees. Literally, why they were there, probably. By flattening the hierarchy, they claim decisions can be made faster and employees can feel more empowered. What a sale! That talk about salesmanship. There's also a not so subtle reframing happening here. They don't call it a layoff. It's a positioned as a strategic workforce design, which is a bit of corporate language that obviously is trying to soften the blow. The company even says it's investing more in frontline roles and digital tools as a result of this restructure. But for all this strategic gloss, It's hard to ignore the reality that cutting nearly half your middle managers is a pretty big shift. Article did not give much insight, this is out of Fortune, into how the remaining managers feel or how employees are supposed to navigate with fewer support layers. There's also a bit of silence around execution. Never shared like how was this communicated, what support was given to those displaced, what type of decisions actually did they deliver better outcomes, or are they just creating new gaps and silos out there? So Jenni, obviously you can tell by my reading of this, I'm pretty skeptical of this. Um, this is being sold as a move for agility and empowerment, but when 40% of your middle managers vanish, I just feel like that creates confusion, overload, and distrust. So what's your take on this kind of streamlining, and how should communicators navigate messaging when the business spin just simply doesn't match the human impact?
So I'm really enjoying our use of air quotes. It's just reminding me of Joey in Friends. He's like, sorry. And I'm really enjoying that today. So I have decided now that this is the second time we've talked about this. So therefore I've decided it's a trend.
There you
That
go.
is happening. That's it now. So we seem to be in a state of we're just going to cut this sort of middle layer. Now, I I do believe that there are some roles in organizations that probably don't need to be there. And I do believe that. I have felt that when I worked in organizations. And I know friends that still work in organizations and have the same questions about their manager and how this is helping them get their work done. But I think that it all depends in the how, right? To your point, because actually, did they just vanish, or was this a carefully considered transformation project that considered all of the different stakeholder groups, communicated it all effectively in the different ways and what this now meant? Because if it didn't do that, then it is just going to create more chaos. And I don't think people often consider that. If I think about an organization I was working with the other week where certain people's hours have shifted as like a return to work for various reasons, and the organizational ways of working haven't shifted to accommodate that. That's the bit that worries me about this. So it's not so much how it's being how it's being communicated, very important, but it's how is the organizational operation shifting to accommodate this change? Because it's a significant change. So how
Hmm.
we work and what we do needs to be fundamentally different as a result of this. And I love this whole like people aren't empowered enough. So we're just going to take these people out. So now you're empowered. You're empowered, okay? Go. That's not how that works. And also, empowered means you have got the ability to do what we need you to do. That's not autonomous, which is almost what they're implying, which is we want you to have more autonomy in terms of making the decisions, but they're using the word empowered, which is different. And I think sometimes we use those two words together, but you can't just remove a layer of people and think now everybody's going to be empowered to make decisions and this is going to be lovely and we'll just go and skip in the meadow. Like that's not how that's going to work. There is huge cultural shifts that need to go alongside that for people to feel empowered. Because if they haven't done this transformation right and they've just gone, right, actually, we're just going to take this out, off you go. I certainly would not feel empowered to do anything. I would be like, I'm going to get my head down. I'm going to keep working. I'm just not going to say anything. And I'm going to ask in case I get anything wrong, because otherwise I might end up like them and just be gone. So I think to answer your question about like, how should communicators navigate that messaging? Um, in terms of that business, to use your words, like kind of business spin and sort of human impact, I think it depends on the reality of that spin, right? So I is it complete spin? What's the reality? What's the real human impact? And you've got to get in and ask all those questions. So if you are working in a comms team and this is happening, then there are all the questions that you need to ask and all of the change elements you need to go through. What I will do is put a link in the show notes to a blog that I wrote a little while ago that mentions a couple of change models that just might be helpful if you're looking at this. Like these are the different concerns to work through and stuff like that. But you've got to ask all the right questions. Like, why are we doing this? What's the impact? But this is significant organizational change. And I feel like it's being talked about as though it's just removing a layer to make things better. the significance of it and the impact of it just shouldn't be underestimated.
Going back to some of your comments on the first article we talked about, I just wish they would be honest about it and say, hey, we're moving too slow. We are not innovating enough. And we've got this really pricey layer in the middle, this cream filling in the middle that we're gonna get rid of. This is gonna mean more work for a lot of you. We're actually not doing less now that 40% of middle managers are gone. A lot of you are gonna have to shoulder more work. I think if organizations were just honest, this is where I want communicators to step in and be like, let's just be honest about this. I think it's then here's my hunch on it. They needed to cut costs. Every business wants to cut costs. They're like, we can remove this 40% and we're still going to run a business because our people are going to then do more work. Ooh, that sounds really bad. Let's actually say we're restructuring for speed and we're removing bottlenecks and we're empowering. It just feels disingenuous. And when that large of a workforce, as you said, just sort of like wiped out of it, it's gonna slow things down immediately. It's not all of a sudden, those people were not roadblocks. They were not in the way. I think now all of a sudden people are gonna be like, we don't even know where to go to do some of these things. And so I actually think it's gonna be slower in the interim. We'll have to see long term what
But
this
I
does.
also think there's something about executives and middle managers, and I think there is a huge disconnect between those two groups. And I've seen this in clients I've worked with in the US and clients I've worked with in the UK, where executives are saying it's the middle managers or it's the one layer down that's slowing us down. And in all the work I've done, I come back to the executives and I say, no, it's you.
Mm-hmm.
Like, actually, like, we need to change what you're doing. Like, you're not being clear enough about what you actually like, what's within their circle of control and circle of influence, or you're not coaching and supporting enough to help them learn and know it's okay to fail, or you're not doing like, not like, and this is where for me all routes kind of look up, but I think it's easy to say we've just got to cut that out, whereas actually if you really looked at it, I think you'd be looking more at yourself as an executive and what you need to do differently to enable things to move quicker, because that's your job.
Next up, we have a workshop released its internal comms trends report for 2025. It was based on a survey of US employees and comms professionals. And while it covers some familiar ground, things like trust, burnout, hybrid work, also delivered some data points that I think is worth digging into. Some of the more striking ones that I pulled out, 60% of employees said they received too much irrelevant internal communication. Only 31% of communicators feel confident they're reaching deskless or frontline workers, depending on how you want to label them. Nearly 70% of communicators say leadership now expects internal comms to be more strategic, but only 22% feel equipped to meet that expectation. Pretty big disconnect there. 59% of communicators said they're burned out or at risk of burnout. 74% of employees still say their most used and preferred channel for updates is email. But again, is that the generic part and irrelevant part? We'll have to see. The report also notes that video and mobile are still rising, particularly for frontline comms, but adoption is patchy, with many teams citing limited tools or budget to actually pull it off effectively. So, Jenni, a couple other numbers that stood out to me, especially that 31% of communicators feel confident that they're reaching the front line. What's your take on that? Is this still a tech problem? Is this a content problem? Or is this something deeper about how we treat non-desk employees?
It's option number three. So it's something deep. In my opinion, it's something deeper, and that's based on the research I've done with this population. So the 31% of communicators feeling confident is partly is wrapped up in lots of other things that's going on here, which is that the content isn't necessarily quite right for that audience. The channels aren't necessarily quite right for that audience. And we don't know, or we don't respect, I'm going to say, use that word, the cultural difference between office workers and deskless, I'll call them, workers. So there is a significant cultural difference between a office worker and a deskless worker in terms of how we communicate, how we talk to each other, what we're doing every day. Like 90% of of out of their work as a deskless worker is doing their work. Like if they're a nurse or they're working on a manufacturing line or any kind of public service, 90% of their time is doing that. For us as office workers, 90% of our time, if not more, is sat at a computer. So it's such a different culture in a different space. So and that confidence piece is because it's really hard to measure, it's really hard to track. Why are you communicating with them? What's the outcome you want? Whereas it's easy with things like email, like you can track that, you can measure anything that's digital. Whereas if you're trying to communicate with deskless workers about a safety issue that they need to be aware of, about how to use something differently or do something differently, the mechanism to have the confidence that that has got through has to rely on line managers and their communication skills. Yes, you can put technology in, but 90% of their time is doing the job, which is often not involved with their phone. Sometimes they can't have it on them at all. So it has to have that human piece. And I think that's the challenge, is that confidence can only come through having really good relationships and networks inside the organization that survive beyond technology. And I don't think we have that. And that cultural difference is so huge, um,
Mhm.
that I just don't think it can be ignored. I'm really interested in this, that gap around being more strategic and 22%, but maybe we can touch on that in a second once you've had some words on that deskless piece.
Yeah, I think it's it sounds very wishy-washy, but to say I think it's all three where tech can be a huge enabler. It can help connect and reach employees who maybe traditionally that wasn't an option. And we've talked about before how it's easy for managers to become overburdened if they are the sole comms channel when everything is having to flow through them. And then talking about receiving irrelevant communication, that's a bit of the content problem as well. Is do we know what they deem relevant or irrelevant? To your point, if there's a safety message, I would hope that they would think that's relevant. But what a communicator might think relevant or a leader might think relevant, that frontline employee might think is very irrelevant. And to your point, there's this culture of, I think at times, almost looking down on frontline employees, which I hope over time we can help sort of shape that conversation a bit more, because especially coming from my background, which is all in manufacturing comms, yeah, there's a lot of frontline employees in manufacturing, but a lot of those people are also skilled trades, which means they can do a lot of things that I have zero idea how to do. And there's an immense amount of intelligence at that frontline level that I think gets overlooked. We talked about in previous episodes about frontline employees not feeling like their ideas are heard or their ideas are valued. Again, tech doesn't solve that. Tech creates visibility to it, but it's the culture that ultimately will help an employee feel like they're part of the solution or part of the team.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, we could talk about the whole deskless worker thing all day, but you're right. So 60% are saying it's irrelevant, and in the deskless, 31% are saying they don't feel confident it's reaching them. They are all interlinked, but the relevance of information is the noise. Like if people say it's noisy, it's because it's not relevant. And 60% of people are saying they receive too much. That just smacks of too much content going out from stakeholders in an office saying we need to communicate this, we need to communicate this, we need to communicate this, without considering the golden rule of comms, which is it's not about you, it's about your audience. And I think that's what we're just missing that at the moment. But if we've got time, I just want to look at this. 70% of communicators are saying that leadership expects internal comms to be more strategic, and only 22% say they feel equipped to meet that expectation. Like that, and you said that, like, that's a huge gap. And there's a podcast I did with the Calmest Rebels, which used to be a podcast I have, where we talked about this whole strategic piece. So I'll put a link in the show notes to that, because we kept coming back to what does that mean when people say that? But that's that gap of being more strategic is big. Like, and I would love to hear from communication professionals what they need in order to bridge that gap. Like what's missing for them to help them be more strategic or be seen as more strategic if they feel they're already doing it. Because I think we need to know what's needed there to help close that.
I'm going to go back to the irrelevant part because I just had this thought that hit me. And this is what the beauty of frequency, Jenny, is we get to see all these puzzle pieces come into place. So 60% here are saying it's irrelevant. In a previous episode, we talked about a research report that Unily and ScreenCloud did around reaching the front line. And that's where we learn, like, in some organizations, it can take 4 to 7 days for content to actually reach frontline employees. That could also speak to the irrelevance of it. By the time it's getting to them, it's too late. Something's already moved on. And so I think there again, we get to sort of see all these things come into play and actually have some of these data points merge together to make some sense. Whereas a lot of that irrelevancy, could it be based on topic? Possibly. Also, irrelevancy speaks to timeliness.
Yeah.
And if it's taking too long to get information to them, they're going to stop paying attention to it straight
Yeah.
out.
And you've just given me a thought then as we're just thinking out loud today. But it'll be really interesting if after we've been doing frequency for, I don't know, like maybe 3 months, we've got like the first quarter and or even the first month um, of all the different reports and things we've seen and looked at, and maybe bringing some of that together of actually what's this showing us across different
Mm-hmm.
reports and insights, like maybe doing like a summary piece of kind of what are those big trends that are coming through at the end of each month or something. I'm thinking out loud now. We should talk about this afterwards. but it's but it's that there's all these different, and this is the challenge. This is why we're doing the podcast, right? Because there's so many different reports and things out there that actually we need to look at them all together and see what they mean. Because ultimately, this report is saying that 74% of people saying email's their most preferred channel. Yet we've spent the last 10, 15 years talking about email should be dead and shouldn't be needed.
Yeah.
And, that's, we're still here and it's still the most popular. So,
Yeah.
yeah, work to do.
All right. The last one is very American centric, but I think this is fascinating to see, and I want to get your perspective from being in the UK. Title is from Weber Shandwick, Business is a New Stabilizer in a Divided Nation. The survey was conducted just after the first 100 days of Trump's return to the presidency, exploring how Americans feel about the role of business in society and what they expect from corporate America going forward. The report surfaces some major tension points that communicators I don't think can ignore. For example, here's some of the data points. 68% of Americans believe companies should address important societal issues, but 40% they said they should only do it if it directly affects the business, and 21% think companies should stay out of it entirely. 79% of Americans want business leaders to use their platforms to influence conversations related to presidential executive actions. 63% of Democrats and 74% of Republicans say the workplace should be politically neutral. Maybe one of the few times you get those two parties to agree on anything. 72% of employees say they should avoid discussing sensitive topics at work. Despite the tension, 6% of employees feel optimistic about their job, and 2/3 feel optimistic about the company. Americans all across both sides of the aisle agree businesses should prioritize these things: protecting employee health and safety, fair pay and pay equity, mental health and work-life balance, and promoting prosperity and stability. All of those were above 80%, which basically is almost everybody. So Jenni, looking at this report paints a picture of a really delicate balance in the US. People want businesses to lead on issues, things like democracy and employee well-being, but also want workplaces to stay politically neutral on some of those topics. So you're based in the UK, and I'm curious, are you seeing some similar expectations play out there, or is the relationship between business and society taking a different shape on this side of the Atlantic?
So I can only talk to the conversations that I've been having with people sort of this year. And I think I would say this is starting to play out here as well. So I think there is a need, certainly with some of the sort of chief people officers and the communications teams and transformation teams that I'm talking to, are saying we need to think about how we are going to communicate some of these more political or societal issues. How do we communicate them? How do we handle them? How do we respond to them? So it's definitely on the agenda of people in comms and HR around what do we kind of we're in that question stage, I think, at the moment. But I also think we've been in that question stage for quite some time. Like, even if I think back to the murder of George Floyd, there was so much, do we, should we, how do we then? And we are 5 years on from that, and we're still having the how do we, should we, do we conversations, which to me comes back to where we started this episode about values and what you stand for and how that links together. So I do think the conversations are still there. I would love to see organizations and communication professionals, I suppose, feel more equipped to know how to do that. And I think that's probably a big gap, because people are worried and scared of saying the wrong thing and getting stuff wrong. And I totally get that. I think the statistic that you shared there, about 40% say that companies should only address the issues if it directly affects the business. And I think that is important. I think it's figuring out, not necessarily that it directly affects the business, but you can't talk about everything everywhere all of the time because there's so much going on. But I think you have to figure out what's appropriate and right for your organization. And again, I don't know how you do that, but I know that that's where people seem to be at the moment, is what do we talk about, when, how, what. And I think there comes a point where you have to have the courage to make that decision and create, for want of a horror, some governance. Oh God, it's all air quotes today. Some governance around how you're going to do that and what you're going to do, um, and do it. And I think that's part of it. I feel like we talk a lot about some of these things, but we don't do it. But I think the blocker to that is creating a safe place for communicators to come together and say, what's everybody doing? What should we do? Can we have a space to talk about that? And maybe that's a space that, I don't know, maybe like Ecology or somewhere could facilitate something like that to help people do it, because I think that's where we're getting stuck.
I looked at this too as, we talked about the value of bringing some of the great things from journalism into the world of internal comms and corporate comms, of bringing that true newsroom mentality to it, of, is this something that our listeners, watchers, viewers, which are your employees, care about? And simply reporting on the news of it without there being an opinion to it. So much of news is now, we've just defaulted to it being opinionated versus just simply reporting the facts on it. I think the more you just rely on facts, then the better. I think the more interesting part for this was those last few data points that I talked about, were what should businesses prioritize, where everybody wants these things: health and safety, fair pay and equity, mental health and work-life balance, and promoting prosperity and stability. 80+% of people all responded favorably to those things. So if a business just focused on those, like, that's what your employees want. So give them that. I think the rest of the political stuff, the way the winds blow the day of the week, is always going to be a challenge. But when you've got 80% of any group agreeing on one thing, that's pretty damn near perfect.
And I think that's such good advice, because it's so easy to get sort of drawn into the noise and drawn into a conversation that maybe you don't need to be having. Whereas actually, if these are the 4 things that people want to hear about, then where are your campaigns, your communications, your leadership stepping up into those spaces and focusing on those? Because actually,
Mm-hmm.
it's almost those hygiene factors again. Like, what are those basic needs that people have, and how are you fulfilling those before you start to work your way up, you know, that ladder of different needs, for want of a better expression. So I think that's really good advice. Like, focusing on those and, have some conversations and some spaces to talk about what are the things that you are going to talk about, but let's get the basics right first.
Yep. Well, that's what I had pulled together for this week, Jenni. Let's get into our freak out moments. Jenni, what are you freaking out about?
So I'm gathering a little list of things I'm freaking out about for us to talk about each week. And this one for me is this this sort of marketing thing that I keep seeing on Instagram mainly, because I spend a lot of time there. But this sort of marketing message of, you now have your evenings back, by getting sort of a ready meal service or a meal delivery service or whatever it is. But this whole thing about having time back, you need to have your evenings back. Now I've got my evenings back. I don't need to cook. Your evening back to do what? Like, to do what? What? To just sit and watch like Netflix? like, genuinely, and I appreciate that for some people there is juggling kids and kids going to club, that all of those things. And I get that. If you are juggling a lot and it's hard to fit that in, then that's fine. I'm just not sure that everybody needs to hear this message of you need to get your evening back. And that means that you shouldn't be cooking food, which is a fundamental part of what we need to do as human beings. And actually, we should all be able to cook some food to have for dinner. And that doesn't need to take up the 6 hours or 4 hours of our evening. And we're just being sort of brainwashed and conditioned into you need your evening back so you can just sit on the sofa and watch Netflix for 4 hours because that's how you should spend your evenings. And it's just annoyed me this week because I've clearly had too many adverts of get your evening back. And my evenings are good. I'm happy cooking in my evenings or going for a walk, or that's fine. I
Yeah,
don't need a
where
balance.
did people's evenings go? I
Yeah,
guess I don't.
this is like what back from where? Away.
I love it. That's a good. That's a good rant.
Right.
I have
Well, that is
two. I have two, and I was scrolling over here to the side to find this one story because I wanted to get the headline correctly. You sent this to me, and I took no offense, Jenny, that you sent this to me. The headline is white men, quote, in pit of worry over doing or saying the wrong thing at work. And I, without even clicking through and reading this article, I'm like, I'm going to hate every part of these excuses of what these white men are saying. And to me, this just screams this ultimate privilege of, for years, decades, centuries, you felt like you can just say or do whatever and there's going to be zero repercussions. And now all of a sudden, you have to be a decent human being, a kind person. And this is this burden that you have to carry, that you're in a pit of worry of being a simple, kind, and decent human being. Just stop. Just it's it's too much. It's too much. It's actually very easy to be a kind and decent person. And there are times where you might do or say the wrong thing out of accident. We all do that. One company I worked at um used the person's wrong pronouns one time. I felt bad. That person didn't correct me in a way, but like, oh, by the way, this is how I prefer to be. Great, sweet. It wasn't a pit of worry. It wasn't, but this now it's like they want to be the victims after victimizing for so long. Stop. Stop. I have zero patience, zero tolerance for being in a, going back to air quotes, a pit of worry over doing
I'm
or
a
saying the wrong thing. Too much. It's
fair.
too much. The
It's fair.
other thing that I'm freaking out, which I'm very excited about though, Jenny, I saw you and I both travel quite a bit, fortunately. Turkish Airlines is now proposing fining passengers for standing up on the plane, which, oh man, you want to get me going on a, like you, so plane
What, every
lands.
time on the plane?
No, 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 no. Let's go through the plane lands. You pull up to
Yeah,
the tarmac, pull up to the
yeah.
jet bridge, bing, plane thing goes off, and it's this race of seatbelts off, and someone's got to get stood up in the aisle, and then it's just this unnecessary line of people that then, like, you can't go anywhere. All you're doing is clogging the one artery to get off the plane, to where, like, when it's my row's turn to get up, like, you're literally standing in my spot, like where I need to get out to get my bag out, when if you just sat down the whole time, let's just relax. Will they institute this? Man, I hope so. I've never flown Turkish Airlines. I will probably never have an opportunity to fly Turkish Airlines, but I applaud this effort, because I also would love, while we're on the wish of changing rules in the airline world, you watch football or soccer,
Yeah,
right, Jenny? They do the thing that I've seen where they do like the shaving cream on the field, and
yeah,
it's like, this is where you stand.
yeah,
If I was a one day I want to be a gate agent. Delta, Southwest, whoever. Well, actually, it wouldn't work for Southwest now. Delta, whoever. You know, when people are like, okay, we're going to start boarding, and then everybody crowds.
Yeah.
And you're like, some of these people are like zone 6.
Yeah.
Sit down. I want to be able to like spray this shaving cream on the big, no one in this zone.
Yeah.
No, we don't need you. If you're zone 2, sit down. We don't need you yet. So I like that Turkish is trying to like fix this problem that very few of us actually see, that are annoyed by, but it's clearly causing a problem if they're actually
Yeah.
looking to fine passengers for standing
Yeah.
up on the plane.
I wonder if they'll do it, because I am a person that does stand up, but I also always like to be on an aisle so that I'm just up and out. So I'm just ready to go at the end. So because I'm on the aisle, I'm like, I can stand up because I'm standing in my spot at the end of my
Are
row.
you
So I'm ready
standing
to go.
up in where your seat is, or have you stepped out into the aisle?
Usually I'm where my seat is, but if I've got to get a bag
Then
down, I'll
that's
have stepped
fine.
out into the aisle. But
Then
then I'm
that's
in
fine.
my
If you're
spot anyway.
but what about the person next to you?
Well,
Is that
it's
their
his or me.
spot?
It's my
Cause
spot.
here's the problem with this. Now we're getting in the rant mode. It's like there's always those times where like people are like, hey, we've got some customers with some tight connections. Let them get off the plane first. If people just stayed in their seats,
True.
those people could get
Yeah.
off. But instead they
Yes.
don't. They stand up, present
Yes.
company
Yeah.
included,
They
block the aisle.
Well, I would sit back down. If I knew there was people that had to get off, I would be like, "You have to go, like,
But
now,
eventually
run."
it gets so clogged that those people can't
Yeah.
even do it.
I
So
don't know how they're gonna do
thank
that.
you. Thank you, Turkish Airlines, for stepping up and teaching people how to fly. And thank you for joining us this week. All the articles that have inspired this conversation, plus other resources, are in the show notes. And do not forget to rate and review after you've listened. Subscribe so you don't miss another episode, and pass this along to someone you think would enjoy listening or watching. You can now find Frequency on YouTube. Thank you to Poet Ali for contributing music to the show. We will be back next week with more news, insights, and opinions about everything comms and leadership in workplaces today. Keep tuning in and turning up.